All right, so picking up exactly where I left off with the last video, um, we are talking about what graphic novels are not for a second. So we did go back and we talked about all the things about comics versus graphic novels. People do like to try and say that comics and graphic novels are pretty much the same thing. In our class, we're going to try and argue against that. Just like when I teach poetry in my other English classes, I use a lot of music. So if I was to use, let's just say an NF song, like, well, I don't know, Lie or Why. There's a song called Why that I actually really like. Um, you could pull probably 30 literary devices out of that. So to me, rap music or really any music is poetry because it's got the same things, but they're different and interesting for different reasons. Same thing with comics and graphic novels. They have a lot of similarities, but that doesn't mean they're the same thing. Graphic novels are much more intricate. So again, this is where we left off. We're going to switch this next slide. Graphic novels are not, right? They're not books with pictures in them thrown in for good measure. By that, I mean The Last Kids on Earth is a graphic novel, right? And it's a Netflix show. I think they're on the second one, third one, maybe now by the time you watch this. It's actually a really cool book, but it's like 75% text and there are pictures with it. So the pictures aren't necessarily telling the story. It's more like the stories told with some pictures thrown in. Think like your science textbook. If they're talking about photosynthesis and they throw a picture in like, hey, this is what this looks like, visual images help, but those visual images aren't telling the story in a college textbook, right? They're just there so you have figure number 1.3 or whatever to look at when you're reading something in your health class or your science or your history class or whatever, right? So it's not that. They're not movie scripts. Although with the recent spate of graphic novel-based Hollywood movies, you might think so. They've gotten to be really popular. Quentin Tarantino has quite a few graphic novel movies, right? The movies that were turned into, or graphic novels that were turned into movies. They're also not simply a collection of a bunch of comic books put together. Although, when you look over in my SSR section in my library there, I do have at least one set, maybe two, of graphic novels that are a series that I probably have 10 of, right? But they're not just that. So they're not just a collection of a bunch of comic books put together. Although it's now common for serialized comics to be published later into graphic novels. By that I mean we have Batman and Wonder Woman and Mrs. Marvel and all that, and Riverdale and Sabrina. So they are turning a lot of comics into graphic novels, just giving them more weight, more meat to them. Some people argue that graphic novels aren't really even a genre of comic books. Like, okay, they're an independent artistic medium that's different in the way that music, poetry, and sculpture are all unique. And I agree with that. I do agree with that last term. I'm going to say that again. They're their own genre, right? They're an independent artistic medium that's different in the way that music, poetry, and sculpture are all unique. That's a good line to get, right? That'd be something good to grab from this for notes. So they are that. They're independent. They're something different. One thing, though, that's not debatable is that graphic novels are super popular right now. In 2006, okay, so we're going back 14 years ago, sales for graphic novels were about 330 million. In dollar amount, that's more than four times as much as 2001. Now, it says next, you'll see how graphic novels are adding ever more zam, blam, and power to their pages, meaning like the more money that you have to throw into something, the better it's going to look, right? Before you go on, I'd really like for you to pause this and look up how much was made in 2020 on graphic novels and share that with me, right? I'd like you to tell me that. So pause for a second, look that up. How much money was made off graphic novels now, right? Because that's a little bit of an antiquated number there. If 330 million was 2006, what is it now? The history of a graphic novel. Now, this is going to be very insightful, okay? Um, Not a snooze fest. I'm going to try and go kind of quick, so try to grab whatever notes you can. So I'm going to go a little bit quicker because there's a lot to be had here, but I also don't want to bore you. So when we talk about the first graphic novel type of images, Egyptians had hieroglyphics, right? Prehistoric humans had cave drawings, and written words don't appear. Often in these contexts, it's mostly just symbols, drawings, pictures, but they had meaning to people living in those times. They could look at something that was all just in pictures and probably get the story. Get it? That's what a graphic novel is. Graffiti art in of itself is a form of hieroglyphics, right? You can look at the um, tagger's name on a wall and maybe whatever story they're drawing. And it's a form of hieroglyphics itself. So visual mediums like graffiti, like graphic novels, like Egyptian hieroglyphics and cave drawings, those are all folklore in a way, right? They're telling a story via pictures. So people needed pictures to communicate. And I love that I had to paste this in. He's looking at the old hieroglyphics and he says, I knew better than to read the comment section. I mean, if they had comment sections back then, like they do in social media, imagine what they would put. But anyway, all right. So as human language continued to advance, words and thus reading was more for scholars and elites. So get where this is going. So reading words, being literate with a text, with a book, was really for scholars and elites and people that were rich. A few hundred years ago, though, mechanization of labor processes helped free up a lot of time for the working class, meaning things that were made from industry, like picking cotton or even making cars, was broken down in such an easy process now that humans are still part of it, but barely. And packaging and, you name it, the labor process in America has been made a lot simpler through industry. Um, it freed up time for people in the working classes who until then had often only used pictures to share ideas in printed media, like, for example, political cartoons in which pictures predominated over words. So if you went into a magazine back in the day and somebody was trying to slam a politician, like Donald Trump or Hillary Clinton or whatever, they'd put a big picture and then a little comic subtext. They wouldn't write, because they didn't have Twitter back then to write a couple sentences of anger or hatred about whatever's going on. They would use images for that. And those were featured in newspapers and almanacs, and to help viewers get a gist of the idea they were trying to convey. So even with politics back then, it was told through images. In 1837, there was a Swiss artist and writer named Rodolphe Topfer. He published an English version of something that was called The Adventures of Mr. Obadiah Oldbuck, which is considered one of the first comic books ever created. So get the name of that. Mr. Obadiah Oldbuck. That was one of the first comics ever created. Oldbuck featured some hallmarks that defined comics. By hallmarks, it means like symbolism, things that are in all things, such as a compelling synergy of text and cartoon pictures. So that's something that really makes up what a comic and a graphic novel are: text and cartoon pictures, as well as panel borders. These elements help move the narrative forward. About 100 years later, comics exploded into popularity, especially in North America. From the late 1930s to the 1950s, comic books took on their familiar format, including their short length and their introduction of the superhero paradigm, and characters such as Superman and Batman, who would become the who would become lasting worldwide celebrities. So basically, the creation of a comic book that was a lot shorter allowed for images to tell the story, and superheroes became more popular because if you have a shorter version of a story and you have pictures telling it, it's geared towards younger ages, and that's where kids started reading things like that and getting superhero stories from. If you have a story like Julius Caesar that's 300 pages, a kid's not going to want to pick that up and read it for fun. But if you have a 12-page book about a bat that can fly around and save people, that's pretty cool. So that's probably why the popularity of that rose, is because it was simpler. All right. World War II helped fuel the popularity of comics because American military men, maybe they had, not a whole lot to read, and this was something that would be entertaining, not always the depressing stuff that you get in the news. Comics provided them with a cheap entertainment abroad, meaning they could get, for 5 cents a comic book overseas, and stereotypical icons such as Superman, who always triumphed over evil, gave them a morale boost too. Meaning, it's like, hey, if I'm fighting against this enemy, it's kind of like Superman fighting against his enemy, and I could do the same thing. As World War II drew to a close, the black and white good versus evil type of superhero comics lost some of their luster and popularity. And to replace those tired themes, publishers began releasing comics with other subjects like horror, crime, and western and sci-fi. Sci-fi became probably one of the most popular versions. Um, the number of pages in comics, though, remained pretty static, pretty much the same until 1950. It was then that St. John Publications unveiled a 128-page comic called It Rhymes with Lust. That is an insanely long comic book, right? So they're not gearing it at kids. Plus, they have the word lust in it. So where are they going with this? Why are they writing a 128-page comic book and putting the word lust in the title? Definitely not geared toward kids anymore. Which the company billed as a first full-length picture novel. This title was an attempt by the author, Arnold Drake, and the illustrator, Leslie Waller, to tie sophisticated writing with equally refined drawn art. Okay, so that's like where they're trying to say, well, let's put really well drawn art in with illustration. All right. It was, in short, one of the first deliberate attempts to make a graphic novel. So Drake, not started from the bottom Drake, Arnold Drake, was one of the first people to try to make a graphic novel with the illustrator Leslie Wall. It Rhymes with Lust was very successful, but it didn't immediately lead to a surge of graphic novels, probably because it was 128 pages. Um, but it also arrived at a time of conflict and tumult in the industry. As you'll discover on my next page, the comic and picture novels were about to become scorned and demonized, maybe because they're writing about lust, by both literary snobs. People were like, this isn't literature, and federal authorities, right? So as they proliferated, as they got more popular, comics were considered harmless, entertaining diversion. But in 1954, here's where things changed, right? Get these down in your notes. In 1954, a psychiatrist named Frederick Wortham, a real-life supervillain to insatiable comic book fans, somebody who ruined comics, right, published a book called Seduction of the Innocent, which named comics as a cause of juvenile misbehavior. So much like when I was a kid and I played video games or listened to music, there were people that were like, well, if you listen to too much rap music, you'll end up swearing and be a bad person. So they actually banned certain forms of rap music, like a Group 2 Live Crew, and they had to sue the government, and they won. And that's why nowadays people are allowed to say whatever they want in rap music, like even as crazy as the Insane Clown Posse. You can say whatever crazy thing you want, or even like American Horror Story or movies like Saw, like things like that are gory. Like, oh, who wants to watch that? But it's American freedom. You can do what you want, whether one person likes it or not. In the 50s, that's not how things were. People, really were about morals, and you didn't swear, and you dressed a certain way and acted a certain way, and comic books were seen as kind of like a shot at that. So they tried to shoot it down, just like with music or anything else. So they tried to ban it. The American public didn't immediately start mass comic book bonfires, but as a result, publishers invented the Comic Code Authority. That's just ridiculous, right? Which directed artists and writers to avoid creating controversial material in order to make assuage, make happy, or calm down parents' fears about comic content. So just like in the 90s, when they went against rap music as being super harmful to people, and they actually banned certain music. That's why there's explicit lyric things that are posted now. When you go to buy music, you'll see a little E if you go to buy it on iTunes. And back in the day when I'd buy a CD, it'd say explicit lyrics. Um, that was what they banned rap music, just like they banned these comic books. All right, once the Comic Code Authority took effect, mainstream comics took a blandness, like, oh, if you can't say certain things, how boring is this going to be, right? And sameness that turned off many readers. A revolution of sorts was inevitable. So in the 60s, a comic counterculture arose, in which no subject matter or style was off limits. Independent publishers distributed these underground comics known as comics with an X. right? Okay, so take notes as to what this is. When I put down what are comics, be able to tell me. It was a purposeful misspelling used to differentiate them from more commercial comics. The letter X was also a nod at the racy stuff, bad stuff that they featured. They had adult-oriented themes such as drug usage, sex, and political statements that were common. So, the 1960s was a time of revolution and a time of anti-government and anti-military, which is, not great. So there was a lot of unrest. So this was a way for people to get their voice out and say, here's how I feel. Whether people agree with it or don't agree with it, again, that's up to everybody. But this was in the 60s another form of like you can't tell me what I can and can't do. The mature themes that were in these comics, though, and the artistic freedom opened up new dimensions in comics and graphic novels, where they were once all superhero flavored comics and they dominated things. They garnered a reputation for comics as childish and adolescent diversions. Comics reformed the medium with grittier, edgier, and funnier works. So it changed the genre. Before it was like, well, these are all superheroes and they're geared towards kids. And now it's like, oh, wow, they can say this in here. It's geared more towards adults. So it opened up for a wider variety of, the idea of a graphic novel versus it being like more, well, it's an over glorified comic book, right? In 1978, there was a major shift in terminology that occurred with the publication of Will Eisner's A Contract with God. The title is often called the first modern graphic novel. Again, get that. The Contract with God. Take that in your notes. It was called the first modern graphic novel, in part because he helped popularize the phrase when people say that. A Contract with God includes 4 short stories that take place in the poverty-stricken part of New York City. The theme is humans' relationship with God. So, again, that's what's credited as the first graphic novel. We're almost done here. So, all right. Eisner presented his book to a publisher, calling it a graphic novel, the term he thought he'd invented. And later he learned that a comic book fan, Richard Kyle, had used the phrase in 1964 at a Comic Amateur Press Alliance newsletter. As the newly promoted designation caught on, a slew of lengthier comics began appearing, hoping to capitalize on the so-called graphic novel phenomenon. Um, and again, now at this point, we're like, oh, graphic novel. It might have a double meaning, right? It might not just be like, you think like pictures, graphic, right? No, like, oh, graphic. Like in the 60s, it started writing about, more racier, more explicit topics. So that's why they call it a graphic novel. Maybe. All right, so keep on reading, and we'll find out why some artists insist on calling their work graphic novels, forcefully rejecting the nomenclature used to describe their comic book forebears, meaning like they really, 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 really like the term graphic novel and don't like being called a comic book. Thanks to the so-called golden age of the comic books in 1930s and 40s, iconic superhero stereotypes are still strongly linked to the comic book genre. So superheroes equal comic books in most people's minds. Because they'd rather avoid those stereotypes, some graphic novel artists purposely avoid using the word comics or comic book to describe their work. Instead, artists and their critics sometimes search for new words such as graphic literature, right? That sounds slightly better, or graphic memoirs. Those linguistic acrobats are just semantics. It's the same thing. The reality is that comics and all other manifestations of sequential art encompass a whole slew of genres and styles. There are action and superhero graphic novels. There's also stories of mystery, drama, horror, romance. There's all kinds of genres. And they all target all age groups from children to teen and adults. You have books like Bone, which are like geared towards like 6th grade. And then you have something like Speak, which the content definitely I wouldn't read below, being a middle teenager. So graphic novels can be fun and flippant or grave and important, right? So here's where I was talking about way earlier, where they take really horrible topics and then try to deal with them in a more palatable way, right? Using graphic novels or anything in between. Graphic novels can deal with complicated topics the same way, the same type of topics that novels address, but like in a different way. Graphic novels can employ an entire range of literary devices such as symbolism, foreshadowing, flashbacks, anthropomorphism. Anthropomorphism means taking something and making it human-like. Plot, metaphor. In some cases, the text may be largely autobiographical, yet in a way that defies categorization. For example, Art Spiegelman, the author of Maus, used the medium to relate true stories about his father's experience during the Holocaust. And in this story, they use mice as people and they deal with the Holocaust in that way, kind of taking away the thought of humans and making them mice and making it a little less graphic in a way for if kids wanted to read about the Holocaust and you used mice to be the ones that were experiencing this. It's not as, I guess, horrible when you read it, but I mean, it was such a horrible thing. It's like, how do you talk about the Holocaust with younger kids? I guess using animals helps. In his book, Jewish individuals are portrayed as mice, and the Nazis are cats, right? For this gut wrenching memoir, he won a Pulitzer Prize, the only one ever bestowed on a graphic novel. That's something to note. But there was certainly nothing stopping him from releasing this work in a long series of comic books instead of a graphic novel. That's just what he chose. And I think that's probably better. I don't know if a bunch of comic books about the Holocaust or whatever that would be a great idea. There is, however, one consistent differentiating factor of regular comic books and graphic novels. That's the place they're sold. Street newsstands sell comics, if there's any left around, like New York, maybe. But to find graphic novels, you got to go to a comic book store, a comic book shop, or a bookstore. Yeah, they used to sell comics on like every corner with the newspapers, right? But that's really antiquated. That's an old school thing. And again, this is my last slide. Geography is no boundary for the popularity of graphic novels. For example, in Japan, readers voraciously devour manga, their version of graphic novels. So this was what on the first or second slide, and I said I'd come back to it, and we're back to it just for a second. We're not going to focus on this too much, but manga creators delve into every topic imaginable in hopes of capturing various slices of their huge manga fan base, which includes men and women of all ages. In fact, the popularity of manga has spilled over into the US, where manga titles are often challenge native language titles as bestsellers. And in fact, here in our Sandberg library, like 80% of the books that we have are manga, right? So, but we're not going to read too much of that. But no matter where they're from, groundbreaking graphic novels aren't hard to find. All right, hopefully you enjoyed all this background and you got tons and tons of notes. Feel free to rewind any of the videos that I gave you. And thanks for taking great notes, guys.